Now we're beginning the OCD section of your panic disorder / OCD notes. And as we go through this, we're going to see, I think, that OCD can become much more than what you may think about when you talk about somebody who has OCD. So let's jump right in and get into our notes and start talking about the clinical description. Now, as you know by now, that I don't deal with the DSM-5 number associated with a disorder. That is for a different class. With me, for this class, what I'm interested in is going through detailing symptoms and then ultimately describing from a biological standpoint what is contributing to the symptomology. So let's start with the clinical description. And OCD is characterized by obsessions and or compulsions that together last at least an hour a day and interfere with one's normal social or occupational functioning. And in all of the disorders we've seen so far in this particular class, there is always that mention of interference with one's ability to carry out daily living, okay? And next, we need to make sure we understand what the difference between obsessions and compulsions is. Obsessions are experienced internally and subjectively by the actual patient. And they're experienced as thoughts, as impulses, or even images. They are intrusive, they're inappropriate, and they cause marked anxiety and distress. And that is really important to remember. Whereas compulsions are repetitive behaviors or purposeful mental acts. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes these compulsions, these behaviors can be observed by others. And often they are actually performed in response to an obsession or according to rigid rules aimed at preventing distress or a negative event by the patient. The patient comes up with, if I do this ritual, then it will preempt any terrible thing that might happen. There are 3 proposed subtypes as of last count. First is altered risk assessment disorder. And individuals with this subtype of OCD exhibit very prominent pathological doubts, anxiety, and undoing behaviors. If, oh my gosh, I didn't go up the steps the way that I should. Let me come back down and start over again. I'll undo that bad way of going up the steps, and then I'm going to go up the correct way. The ability to assess whether something is possible in contrast to it being probable in terms of the consequences is severely impaired. And it leads to escalating anxiety and ritualistic behavior. And that is engaged by the patient to undo or neutralize feared consequences. Okay. Incompleteness, habit spectrum disorder, is the second subtype. The primary symptoms of this subtype is feelings of incompleteness or the need for perfectionism. And it leads to rising tension as opposed to anxiety. It's not necessarily anxiety. It can be related to rising anxiety, but very often it would be more considered tension. And then when you perform a particular ritual, that tension is released. Individuals with this particular subtype of OCD have an increased occurrence of tics and trichotillomania. If most of you know what tics are, most of you probably know what trichotillomania is, but trichotillomania refers to the pulling out of hair, and that can include the hair on your head, can include your eyebrows, can include your eyelashes. In some cases, actually, individuals eat this. As somebody who cannot stand the hair in my food, this would not be something I could do, but it is something that does occur. And I've decided to add Tourette's disorder to this course material. At the very end is the last particular, I think it'll be the last one, topic that we'll do. It will be brief, but I think it's worth taking a look at, and often as an offshoot of some of this OCD. Not necessarily the same thing though, okay? Not the same thing. And then third, we have spectrum disorder in terms of psychosis, psychotic spectrum disorder. And this is different in that the individual actually believes that most of their OCD symptoms are rational, they're reasonable, unlike those others who they have to do them, but they know in their somewhere that this is not really rational, this is not reasonable. In this case, they totally, no, this makes sense, this is reasonable, this is rational. They tend to be delusional and unfortunately very treatment resistant. And towards the end, or at the end of this lecture, I'm going to actually open a reading that I gave to you and look at some of these particular cases. I also provided a link right at the bottom of this outline, so it's easily accessible and you can go on and look at it some more. This type is the most frequent form after somebody has suffered brain trauma, lesions in the brain, or an infection that infiltrates the brain. Now get ready to rock and roll here with some of the genes that are exposed, that are related to this particular disorder, OCD in general. Some data suggest a genetic component. And one of the culprits is suspected to be the HOX, H-O-X, B8 gene. I just say HOXB8 gene. And this happens to be one of the serotonin genes, and very often an autoreceptor type gene. Now, so it's a 5-HT1D with a little B receptor gene. Now, let me just say that initially when people first started really being able to determine the genes and relate them to actual receptors, it was, you know, pretty basic, and then they kept adding, and then they kept adding both to the receptor subtypes from 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, 5-HT, as opposed to the, for example, 5-HT2A, which is that one that is on a postsynaptic receptor, for example. Now, if this gene is affected or it has a certain characteristics, it's possible that it may predispose somebody to OCD. Okay. There has been observed abnormal neuronal activity and alterations in neurotransmitters in individuals with OCD. But once again, we have this scenario, and there are studies and experimental studies that hopefully can tease this out, but it's still unclear as to whether these abnormalities are the cause or the effect of the OCD. Remember, and if I know I say this about other things too, so I'm sorry about that, but one of the things that I hope that you remember from this course, if you forget some of the little details and specifics, is that your brain changes. There's plasticity. And if there are certain behaviors that you engage in on a very regular way, it can alter your brain. It can alter brain structures. It can alter brain neurotransmitter activity. Or it's possible that these exist on their own and these contribute to the expression of OCD symptomology. But basal ganglia, remember the good old basal ganglia, all right? And that group of structures and part of the striatum, the basal ganglia are implicated. And these have the structures of the basal ganglia are projections, have projections from the orbitofrontal cortex to the basal ganglia deep inside. And they seem to be abnormal in many individuals when PET studies are conducted. So, and if you think about some of the ritualistic behaviors and some of the more repetitive behaviors, I think this makes sense. So what is a hypothesis in response to these observations? One, could be serotonin dysfunction. Wow, here we go again. Serotonin, it appears everywhere. Very important for normalized serotonin activity, normal serotonin receptor, both in number and both in conformation. So the idea that serotonin dysfunction may be at the root of OCD stems largely from pharmacological treatment studies. It's one of those things, as you've seen way back and in the very beginning of the semester, that sometimes you treat somebody with a drug and then you notice something that you weren't expecting. You perhaps were administering this treatment for a completely different disorder. And then you observe changes in behavior that steer you in the direction of another one. Clomipramine, which is an SSRI, often shows a reduction in OCD symptoms when administered. Another line of evidence that is promoted in terms of the serotonin dysfunction is that peripheral markers of serotonin show a strong positive correlation with improvement of OCD symptoms in response to SSRIs. So 5-HIAA, which is a precursor of serotonin, and blood platelets carry actually some serotonin with them. They increase in serotonin. Once you elevate this, and you see these elevations via blood work and other ways, you get an improvement of OCD symptoms. However, and you knew that was coming, right? I'm sorry that has to happen so often. These markers do not always show an abnormality in untreated OCD patients. So there are OCD patients who do not have markers that indicate abnormal serotonin levels. And on top of that, 40% or thereabouts of OCD individuals with OCD do not even respond to SSRIs. Okay, so so it must be something else. Well, it might be this, or there might be another contributory factor, or it might be both. And so let's take a look at, you knew this was coming too, I think, dopamine overactivity. High doses of, let's go back, of dopamine agonists. Any drug, anything that will increase the activity of dopamine, whether it's increased release, keeping it out in the synapse longer, stimulating more receptors with it, whatever, but increased dopamine over activity will actually induce stereotyped movements in lab animals that resemble compulsive behaviors in humans. Okay, so you're like, well, how do you know? Well, guess what? Rats, and I've observed this, can engage in stereotypical behavior such as normal rats will groom, okay? And one of the things, and it's cute, I'm sorry, it's really cute. They take the little front paws and they go like this. And then they groom other parts of themselves and they do things. Some of them, if they have too much of this repetitive stereotypical behavior, will groom themselves raw, will lose their fur in the areas that they're grooming, or sniffing. Sniffing is very important to rats. Getting up and kind of getting a sense of where they are spatially is important. So suddenly you can have rats, if they have some kind of dopamine agonist, start sniffing ridiculously so, going around and being very repetitive in their behavior. Abuse of stimulants such as amphetamines by humans causes purposeless, although complex and repetitive behaviors that are very similar to those seen in OCD. Amphetamines incredibly increase the availability of dopamine in multiple ways. We talked about that early on in an earlier lecture. So again, dopamine is implicated. Cocaine, again, a dopamine agonist, big time, can worsen compulsive behaviors in patients with chronic motor tic disorders such as Tourette's syndrome. And a strong relationship exists between OCD symptoms and several neurological disorders that are associated with dysfunction of dopamine in the basal ganglia. This is making me think I should put Tourette syndrome right after this lecture. We'll see. Between 45% and 50% of Tourette syndrome patients also have obsessions and compulsions. In fact, a high percentage of Tourette syndrome patients would meet the diagnostic criteria for OCD if it were considered completely alone, separate, okay? And perhaps, is a thought, a common genetic factor may manifest itself as obsessions and compulsions in some individuals and as tics in others, another putative theory. Neuroleptics, remember? Oh, that's another thing. Neuroleptics block, decrease dopamine activity. And depending on whether they're typical, conventional, or atypical, it can be hit all of the dopamine pathways or selectively dopamine pathway. So if you give somebody who's already on an SSRI a neuroleptic, you can often see a reduction in the severity of OCD symptoms. In those patients who, when administered SSRIs alone, did not have much improvement. So it should come as no surprise that there's also the serotonin dopamine hypothesis of OCD. Both systems, this hypothesis says, may be involved in at least some forms of OCD. And I personally think that makes a lot of sense. And the question comes, and the question is being investigated experimentally in many labs, is it primarily serotonin and dopamine levels, or is it a balance of serotonin to dopamine that is most important? Is it the balance, the ratio of serotonin and dopamine gets out of kilter, and that will produce the symptomology of OCD? Here, I actually put this in bold in italics, which means, let's take a look at it. It could be important. Perhaps that tonic inhibition that serotonin can have in many dopamine neuron populations isn't there the way it should be. And that results in increases in dopamine function in the basal ganglia. So as I put here, let me read it. Perhaps decreases in serotonin tonic inhibitory influences on dopamine neurons lead to increases in dopamine function in the basal ganglia. And if you take a look at that would explain why both are involved. And just as a reminder, serotonin performs so many jobs in our brains, and one of its jobs in certain areas is to kind of hold down the inhibition dopamine neuronal activity. And when you take away that inhibition, those inhibitory influences, maybe because there isn't enough serotonin there, you end up with more dopamine being released and acting on receptors. And thus, you could potentially have these behavioral symptoms. No one is for sure yet. My best guess is it's all of the above. And I really think that this theory is rational and reasonable. And I will definitely, I will support the idea that both serotonin and or dopamine play a role in these particular symptoms and in the overall demonstration of OCD. Okay, so let's talk about drug treatments. I am so happy if you're ahead of me by now. You're like, well, SSRIs, we should probably increase the availability of serotonin. Bingo. SSRIs tend to be the foundation of treatment for individuals who present with OCD. Difference is the doses are often, or most often, greater than those that are utilized for people who present with clinical depression. And another problem is therapeutic effects may be even more delayed than those effects that we see in individuals who are being treated with SSRIs for clinical depression. So it's a weight game. It's a weight game. And you know the problems with that, some of which being if you're having side effects, you're like, is this even worth it? Because I'm not seeing an improvement. And another thing, if you just give SSRIs as the treatment, there's only about a 35% reduction in symptoms, and there is a high incidence of relapse. So there we go. Let's talk about adjunctive therapies. So let's say we're using SSRIs as the foundation. What can we do? Combination therapies include something like, let's replete or refill, if you will, serotonin if it is not there. So if this is going to seem counterintuitive at first, but hang with me here. If we slow serotonin neuronal firing with the 5-HT1A partial agonist buspirone or Buspar, you can help OCD symptoms. Why? I just said right here, right, that we're going to slow the firing because the stores can build up, because what you haven't done is change the synthesis in this neuron. You've only slowed how much it's released. So there's more being, synthesized, and there's more in the pot, if you will. And so when it is released, when the firing occurs and there's a release, you've got more serotonin coming out into the synapse, to put it very simplistically. Okay, so Buspar could be an additional, an adjunctive therapy. Perhaps, however, a neuron can't even release its own serotonin. It's got lots of serotonin built up, and it's like, can't release it, can't do it. So we can use fenfluramine, which will increase the neuron's release of serotonin. And now the SSRI blocks the reuptake of that serotonin that's been released keeping it in the synapse longer so it can have a bigger effect on the postsynaptic neuron. Third, now hopefully you're thinking ahead, and we talked about serotonin or dopamine or both. Okay, so we're treating this patient, let's say, with treatments that will alter serotonin availability overall. But we're still not seeing enough. Okay, add a neuroleptic. Neuroleptics block dopamine receptors. And this is particularly good for those individuals who have like Tourette syndrome symptoms, those very schizophreniform type symptoms, or delusions. Yes, delusions, which occur in some individuals with OCD. Finally, fourth, these are the four I'm giving you for purposes of this course. Add a benzodiazepine. If you add a benzodiazepine, which remember what it does, it increases GABA activity. You might be able to pump up the dosage for the SSRI without suffering the consequence of those extra symptoms you don't want, increase in anxiety, okay? Other treatments include behavioral psychotherapy. And again, just as I pointed out in other disorders, sometimes you need to start working with drug treatments before you can get to the place of utilizing this behavioral psychotherapy. Sometimes not, sometimes not. And secondly, this is not for most people, psychosurgery. For very extremely severe cases, yes, that might be a redundant statement, but I'm talking about those cases which are so severe that they can be life-threatening. And they're not, and this individual is not responding to typical drug treatments and therapies or anything else. The patient may actually undergo something called a cingulotomy. And this is where the neuronal loop that connects the cingulate gyrus, in the cingulate area, the gyrus being the bulge between the grooves, right? And the frontal lobes. So you've got this loop that might have gotten in this stuck-on position that just keeps promoting these very horrible types of behaviors and symptoms. This will get cut and stop that. Long-term effects, they're starting to know more. I should probably have expanded this. I will say some of the deficits that can be observed from this are probably common sense. That in doing this, you can also, by reducing the feedback loop, you can also reduce communication between parts of the brain. How severely this may impact the patient is dependent on many things. The patient itself, it's the person's own brain structure, neurotransmitter involvement. So bottom line is, don't go jumping out and asking for cingulotomies right off the bat. It's a very serious disorder for some people. And I know I want to make a little commentary here on my own before I go into this one document that I want to bring up for you real quickly. And that is, you hear so many people, I'm sure you do, I do, say, oh, I'm so OCD, because they want their calendar right. They want to make sure they have everything put down in their schedule. They want their room to be neat. And they, they call that being so OCD. Some of us have tendencies. I have tendencies that, fortunately, I have been able to behaviorally, cognitively control. And just a little example is when I was, years ago, I would leave home to go to school, work, whatever I was doing. And I've always had animals living in my house with me, always. And I would get so far and I would start the thought, oh my God, did I turn off the coffee maker, which at the time didn't have an auto turn off? Oh, I don't know. I don't know. Or did I, oh my gosh, did I turn off and unplug my curling iron? Oh my gosh, I don't know. I never use it anymore, so it's not a problem. And I would get to the point, what I would do is picture my house on fire and my cats and dogs all looking out the windows, frantically going, oh my God, help us, help us, help us. I would so often turn around, go back just to check on things, which is really bad to do because, as you know, like the dogs are like, oh, she's home, yay! Because they act like you've been gone for, 6 hours, and then I have to leave again. And all but one time, things were turned off. So I started my own little project here, and I gave myself a limit. Okay, once I get to this point in my trip, and I've always had to drive a fair amount because I've always lived out in the country, most of the time anyway. And I will not go back. I will not go back. So, this anxiety. But what I did do was once I got into my office or wherever I was going, call my home and see if the answering machine answered, with the idea that, oh, my house isn't burnt down if my phone service is still working and it goes into my answering machine. And at that time, if that wasn't true, if there was a way for it, I didn't want to know about it, because then I could put it away and go about my day. Some of you may have those kinds of mental images and thoughts that are triggered or occur in an almost predictable manner. Some of you might be checkers. I'm a checker. I'm not an obsessive checker to the point where I can't ever leave the house and I have to keep going back and I can't leave anything. But I check to make sure my car is locked, even though there's nothing in it to take. Now it's great because I can just keep clicking my, and hearing it beep, 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 and before I go through it, beep, 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 yeah, it's done. But before, way back when I had an older car, you push down the buttons to lock your door. Oh my God, I will get so far away from it. All I have in it, or maybe a couple of stuffed animals people had given to me and they traveled with me. There was like nothing valuable in my vehicle. And honestly, if it would have been stolen, it probably would have been good for me because I probably could have gotten a better vehicle in the end. I would go so far, I'd have to go back, pull on every door, make sure it was locked. And I'd allow myself to do it 3 times. Then I'm like, whatever. But I've gotten over that. But again, I could go around and go to everybody, oh, I'm OCD. No, I have some tendencies. I've nipped them in the bud. And fortunately for me, I didn't turn into full blown and require tons of medication. Not everybody can do that. And I share this only because sometimes I think people feel very alone when they truly have full-blown OCD, and especially when they hear all these other people go, oh, I'm so OCD, and yet they see how different their lives are. And then the individual who truly has clinically diagnosable OCD starts going, oh my God, what else is wrong with me? What is wrong with me? What happens with me is way different. So that's just a little aside I'd really like you to think about. And last but not least, I do want to bring, oh shoot, where did I put it? Oh, right here, beautiful. Going to bring up this other link real quickly, just go through a couple of things, and just to show you how serious some forms can actually be. And I have like the worst computer ever that takes a super long time, and I really do need to save my pennies and get a new one. So bear with me, please. Okay. This is actually a follow-up. When I first started teaching this course, I found this article with true case histories of obsessive compulsive disorder and delusions. And I was like blown away. And so I would bring it into the classroom. And then this is a follow-up to that. And let's go down. Ooh, please open up all the way. I'll view HTML. This should work. And okay. This first one is one I really want to go over. And let's get rid of you. And let's get you over here. Okay, case one. I'm not actually going to read it to you. You know, I don't do that often, but I so want you to see this. And I'm so afraid that because you're so busy, that you'll just go, oh, it's the link, it's not important. It is. Okay, case one, we're referring to this guy as Z. Z suddenly developed rituals at age 17. While watching television, he looked up and saw a man's face at the glass kitchen door, and he heard a voice say, "Do the habits and things will go right." So Z came to believe in a power that could bring him luck if he could retain it within his possession through ritualizing. He bought an electric guitar, which he felt contained the power, and would turn the controls on the electric guitar ritualistically. He often saw a black dot the size of a fist leave his body and enter some object around him. When experiencing the loss of this black dot, he felt compelled, okay, go back and look at diagnostic criteria, to ritualize, to regain the power that he believed was contained in it. At age 19, 2 years later, he began to believe that a workman possessed a second power for evil and began a second set of rituals to ward off this evil power while striving to retain the good one. Now think about the complexity of your life at this point. He believed absolutely in the power and feared disastrous consequences for himself and his family should he fail to retain the good and repel the evil power. So before his admission to the hospital, America is the only place where we say the hospital. European countries, it's hospital. Before his admission to hospital, obsessions and compulsions affected every area of his life. Before performing any action, he felt compelled to imagine the letter L and the phrase X away, power back for up to 20 minutes. He felt unable to sit on chairs or walk on grass or leaves and slept with his feet uncovered for fear of the power being transferred to some object from which he might be unable to retrieve it, which that doesn't, to me, I'd be like, I'm going to cover my feet because I don't want to lose it. But he saw it in a different way. On leaving home, he constantly retraced his steps to place his foot on a crack in the pavement or a leaf that he felt he had trodden on and so lost some of the power. So he would deliberately walk on cracks as opposed to those people who won't walk on a crack. If he saw the black dot leave his body, which happened about 20 minutes a day, reportedly, he had to touch the object it had entered in his mind and superimpose the letter L and say the phrase X away, power back in his mind until he saw the black dot return. From age 18, Z also had recurrent depression, hopelessness, and suicidal urges, with deliberate self-harm, which included overdoses and wrist slashing when he was in a depressed mood. He said he harmed himself to appease the power or as a wish to die when everything was perfect after a day of ritualizing. There are more cases in this article. I do hope you'll take a few minutes to read through them. I think they're really enlightening in terms of what OCD can actually develop into, and it's the spectrum, psychotic form. But you can imagine somebody's life being totally devastated, and unfortunately, this form is very hard to treat, very, very difficult to treat. So that's kind of a sad ending to this particular lecture. And I just felt it was really important for you to understand that OCD is simply not wanting your closet to be arranged correctly, in case that is something that somebody might tell you. That there are clear-cut diagnosable symptoms before you are considered to have obsessive compulsive disorder. There are different forms of OCD, and this last form is not real common. It does exist, and it's treatment resistant. So hopefully this lecture has helped you get a little bit fuller understanding of OCD and the biological mechanisms and underpinnings, and that it makes sense. And with that, we are going to end this lecture and see you again.